Okay, so imagine you're looking at a region of the world where basically in a single lifetime, the population goes from uh, like a 3% literacy rate
Mhm.
to suddenly publishing exponential amounts of advanced scientific research.
Right.
Like, we are talking about jumping straight from an era where a grandfather couldn't even read the deed to his own farm to his granddaughter writing code for machine learning algorithms.
Yeah, it's a complete paradigm shift.
It is. It's totally wild. And today, we are actually tearing up the traditional map of the world.
Hmm.
Because usually, when you think about looking at a globe, there is this expectation of permanence. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you look at a continent, you see the bold lines drawing the borders of a region, and you just assume, well, that's just how the world is categorized. That's the bucket.
Exactly, the lines we all memorized in grade school.
Right. But when you step into the world of global economics and demographic data, that fixed map really starts to blur. We're looking at a landscape that is incredibly fluid.
It's the absolute definition of a shifting paradigm. I mean, those traditional map lines only tell a tiny fraction of the story of how human beings and capital actually move today.
So true. So let's unpack this, because today we are taking a deep dive into this really fascinating, incredibly dense 15-page academic presentation.
Oh, it is dense.
Very. It's titled MEA Region Comprehensive Development Assessment, Multidimensional Analysis of Economic, Demographic, and Social Transitions.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, academics love their titles. But our mission for this deep dive is to look right past the daily news headlines. We want to strip away the noise of the 24-hour news cycle and examine the hard, long-term data that is quietly redefining just a massive chunk of the globe.
Which is so crucial to do because, when you hear about this part of the world in the news, you're almost always getting a snapshot of a single crisis, right?
Like a geopolitical flare-up.
Exactly. Or maybe a single triumph on a single day. But this presentation forces us to look at the macro trends over decades. And I think to start, we really have to establish exactly where we are looking. So MEA. It stands for Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
And right there, I mean, on the very first page of this presentation is a detail that completely threw me, but it really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about today.
A reclassification.
Yes. As of July 1st, 2025, Afghanistan and Pakistan were officially moved from the South Asia classification into the Middle East and North Africa region in the World Bank data.
Yeah, and that reclassification is just critical. It's not, people might think it's just some administrative quirk, right?
Like a clerk at the World Bank just tidying up a spreadsheet.
Exactly, moving a column over. But it's not. It represents a really fundamental shift in how analysts, economists, and global investors are viewing the actual gravitational pull of regional economies.
But I have to push back on this right out of the gate, because think about physical geography for a second. Why does grouping these specific countries together matter so much? Like, does shifting a border on a spreadsheet, literally plucking two massive countries out of the South Asia bucket and sticking them into the Middle East bucket, does that actually change how we understand global economics?
It absolutely does, because it changes the denominators and the numerators of the data we use to predict the future.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about why countries are grouped together in economic data in the first place. It's not just about who shares a physical border, it's about shared economic destinies.
Right.
Historically, sure, Afghanistan and Pakistan might have been grouped with South Asia because of, say, historical trade routes or certain agricultural parallels. But today, this new grouping allows us to see shared macro trends in demographics, resource dependency, development, hurdles, things we would completely miss if we kept them separated.
So it's basically about grouping countries that are going through the exact same growing pains at the exact same time.
Precisely. These countries across North Africa, right through the Middle East, and now into Afghanistan and Pakistan, they share incredibly similar trajectories right now.
Okay.
We're talking about massive youth populations entering the workforce simultaneously. We're talking about energy economies desperately trying to transition away from fossil fuels. And, the awkward, often painful shift from agricultural and extractive economies into service-based knowledge economies.
So by putting them in this new MEA bucket, the data reveals this unified story.
Yes, a story of a region trying to completely rewrite its economic DNA.
We really can't talk about rewriting an economy without looking at the checkbook, right? You have to understand the wealth being generated, to understand the people living there. And the data story on this region's wealth is just wild.
It really is.
The presentation tracks something called the adjusted net national income. And they measure this in constant 2015 US dollars. And if you look at the line graph, starting right around the year 2000, there is this massive accelerated climb.
A huge spike.
But I want to pause here for a second. Why use adjusted net national income? Like, why not just use GDP like everyone else always does on the evening news?
That is a great question, and it's actually vital for understanding the specific region. So GDP, gross domestic product, it just measures the total value of goods and services produced,
Yeah.
right? It measures
It is
activity.
massive happening.
Exactly. But it doesn't measure sustainability. Let me give you an example. If a country decides to chop down its entire national forest in one single year and sells all the timber, its GDP for that year will skyrocket.
Right, because of all the sales.
Right. It looks like an economic boom on paper. But in reality, the country is now fundamentally poorer because it just depleted a massive finite natural resource.
Oh, okay. It's like selling off all your living room furniture to pay the rent.
Yes, perfect analogy. You have cash today, but you have nowhere to sit tomorrow. Adjusted net national income accounts for that depletion of natural resources. It also accounts for the depreciation of fixed capital. It basically subtracts the value of the furniture you sold from your income.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this is incredibly important for the MEA region because so much of its historical wealth comes from pulling finite resources out of the ground. Oil, natural gas, minerals.
Right, extractive wealth.
Exactly. So when we see the adjusted net national income climbing significantly post-2000, like the chart shows, it means the region isn't just liquidating its natural assets, it is actually generating true net new wealth.
Which is a huge distinction.
Yeah.
And you really see that wealth trickling down into individual pockets in the data, too. Because the gross national income, or GNI, per capita climbs impressively. The presentation notes a jump from around $5,915 all the way up past $16,000 in recent years.
Yeah, a massive leap.
But again, the report uses a really specific metric here, and I want to make sure we're clear on it. It says, purchasing power parity in current international dollars. Let's translate that for the listener. What does that $16,000 actually feel like to a real person living there?
So purchasing power parity, or PPP, is essentially the great equalizer in economic data.
Okay.
If I just convert $16,000 into a local currency using whatever the exchange rate is at a bank that day, it doesn't actually tell you much because rent, food, and healthcare cost vastly different amounts in, say, Cairo or Karachi than they do in New York or London.
All right. A dollar goes further in some places.
Exactly. PPP adjusts the data based on what a dollar can actually buy locally. So when we say the GNI per capita went from under 6,000 to over 16,000 in PPP terms, we're saying the actual lived material standard of living, like the ability to buy groceries, secure housing, purchase consumer goods, has nearly tripled for the average person.
Oh, well.
It is a phenomenal wealth generation event.
I mean, a tripling of purchasing power in that time frame is life-changing for a family. But, and here's the catch, the presentation immediately throws a bucket of cold water on that success story. Because the researchers highlight the extreme, almost violent cyclical volatility of this wealth.
Yeah. It is the defining economic hurdle of the region, without a doubt.
You look at the annual GNI per capita growth rates, and it is not this smooth, comforting line going up and to the right. It looks like an electrocardiogram of a patient in distress.
That's a good way to put it.
You have years where the growth rate spikes over 7 or 8%. Total boom year. But then, almost immediately, it's followed by sudden crashes where the growth drops -8 or even -10% in a single year.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, that volatility is the direct result of how this wealth is generated. The MEA region is still deeply, deeply entangled with global commodity cycles.
Right.
When global demand for energy is high, the wealth pours in and you get that 8% spike. Governments have surplus cash, infrastructure gets built, people get hired, everything's great. But commodities are inherently unstable.
Because they rely on the rest of the world buying them.
Exactly. When global markets hiccup, or when a new energy technology emerges elsewhere, or when commodity prices just crash, the bottom completely falls out of the MEA economy.
It makes me think of an analogy. The MEA economy is like a high-performance sports car.
Right? Okay, I follow.
It's got this massive V12 engine, which is that incredible accelerated growth potential we saw in post-2000. But the problem is, it's driving on a road made entirely of loose gravel.
Ah, yes. The commodity market.
Exactly. The gravel is the commodity market. It has all the horsepower in the world, but it constantly struggles to find traction. So the driver slams the gas, the car surges forward terrifyingly fast. That's your 8% growth year. But then the wheels slip on the gravel, the car fishtails, and it loses all its momentum. That's your negative 10% crash.
That is exactly how it functions mechanically. And actually, a sudden influx of commodity cash can actively destabilize an economy. Economists sometimes refer to this as the resource curse or Dutch disease.
Dutch disease, what's that?
It's when a ton of foreign money floods in to buy your oil or gas and it inflates your local currency. That makes it incredibly hard for any other sector in your economy, like manufacturing or agriculture, to export their goods competitively.
Oh, because their goods become too expensive for the rest of the world to buy.
Exactly. So the economy becomes even more reliant on that one single commodity, making that gravel road even looser.
And just think about what that fishtailing feels like for the people actually strapped inside that car.
Mm.
Imagine you, the listener, trying to plan your life in an economy that can grow by 8% one year, giving you a promotion, a raise, a sense of absolute security, and then shrink by 10% the next year, bringing mass layoffs, hyperinflation, and slashed government services.
It's incredibly stressful.
How do you sign a 20-year mortgage in that environment? How do you confidently have 3 children, knowing their college fund could be completely wiped out by a dip in the global price of natural gas?
You can't. It makes long-term planning incredibly difficult. Volatility fundamentally breeds short-term thinking. If you're an entrepreneur, you are way less likely to invest 10 years into building a factory if you know a cyclical crash could wipe out your customer base next year.
Right.
So it discourages long-term investment by citizens, and it certainly spooks foreign direct investment.
But here's the thing. Human beings don't just stop having children or growing up or aging just because the economy is having a volatile year.
Yeah.
And this collision between a volatile economy and a changing population brings us to one of the most structural shifts happening in the world today. The MEA region is undergoing a massive, massive age shift.
Yes. We really need to visualize the population pyramids here to understand this. For decades, the demographic profile of the MEA region was a classic wide-based pyramid.
Like an actual triangle.
Exactly. A massive bulging base of young children tapering up to a very narrow top of older adults. It meant the vast majority of the population was very young.
But the data in this presentation shows that the pyramid is reshaping itself right before our eyes. The 0 to 14 age bracket is dropping fast. Historically, it was roughly 44% of the total population. I mean, think about the infrastructure required for that. Almost half of every human being in the entire region was under the age of 15.
Right.
But today, according to the data, it has dropped to 31.9%.
And simultaneously, the total population growth rates are on a long-term downward trend. They've dropped from historical highs of over 3.2% annual growth down to under 2% today.
So families are just having fewer children overall. What is the actual mechanical effect of that on the broader economy?
It creates the exact conditions for what macroeconomists call the demographic dividend. And this is all about something called the dependency ratio.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. In any society, you have a working age population, which is usually defined as people ages 15 to 64. And then you have dependents, that's children under 15 and the elderly over 65. The dependents consume resources, right? Schools, pediatric care, pensions, but they don't produce economic output.
Right. A 10-year-old isn't paying income tax.
Exactly. When you have a society where 44% of the population is under 15, your working adults are stretched incredibly thin. Every single worker is supporting a large number of dependents. This means families spend almost all their income on basic survival and childcare.
Food, clothes, school books.
Right. They have no surplus income to save. And if families aren't saving, banks don't have deposits. If banks don't have deposits, they can't lend money to businesses to build factories or fund innovation. Capital is just scarce.
Okay, I see where this is going. So as the birth rate drops and that 0 to 14 bracket shrinks from 44 down to 32%.
The ratio flips. The belly of the pyramid, the working age population, bulges out. Suddenly, you have a massive influx of adults who are earning wages, but they have fewer dependents to feed, clothe, and educate.
Which changes everything.
It does. This means families finally have surplus income. They start putting money in savings accounts. Banks suddenly have a massive pool of domestic capital, which they then lend out, fueling a massive wave of industrialization and infrastructure building. This exact shifting of the dependency ratio is the hidden engine that fueled the historic economic miracles in East Asia in the late 20th century.
Wow. It's a historical sweet spot. But looking at the volatility of the MEA region that we just talked about, isn't a massive youth bulge historically a double-edged sword?
Very much so.
Because if a third of your country is suddenly in their 20s, full of energy, ready to build a life, and they find out the economy is currently fishtailing on that gravel road, that sounds like a recipe for profound social unrest.
You hit the nail on the head. A demographic dividend is only a window of opportunity if those working age people actually have jobs to go to. If you have a massive bubble of 20-somethings entering the workforce and you have jobs for them, your economy explodes in productivity. It's a golden era.
But if you don't?
If you don't have jobs for them, it becomes a demographic nightmare. You get sky-high youth unemployment, extreme frustration, and political instability. The window opens, but it also closes. As those workers age and eventually retire, the dependency ratio will flip back the other way.
Just imagine the sheer pressure on the governments in this region right now. If millions of people are graduating high school or university, and they are no longer just sitting at a desk in a primary school, how quickly do you have to build factories, office parks, software companies, and transportation networks just to accommodate them?
You have to build it at a breakneck pace. And remember the catch we established earlier. Capital is very hesitant to make those 20-year infrastructure investments in a highly volatile environment.
Oh, right. The gravel road keeps investors away.
Exactly. So the tension in the MEA region right now is palpable. They have this ticking clock of immense human potential just waiting to be unleashed, but they need the infrastructure to absorb it.
Which naturally leads to the next massive question. If you have this giant influx of young adults ready to work, what exactly can they do? Like, what is their skill level? Have they been prepared to compete in the 21st century global economy? And this part of the assessment, I have to say, might be the most optimistic, staggering set of statistics in the entire 15 pages.
It really documents the birth of a knowledge society.
The numbers are almost hard to comprehend. In the 1970s, adult literacy in this region was hovering around 3%. 3%.
It's hard to imagine now.
If you walk down the street, 97 out of 100 adults could not read a newspaper, could not read a contract, could not write down a list of instructions. But today, adult literacy has skyrocketed to approximately 75%.
And it is even more profound when you look at the youth. Youth literacy is now over 95%, and primary school enrollment is virtually universal, sitting at over 90% across the entire region.
The logistics of that alone are just mind-boggling to me. To teach millions of children, you need hundreds of thousands of teachers. But if the adult literacy rate was 3% just a few decades ago, where did the teachers come from? How do you build an education system when practically no one is educated?
Right, it's a chicken and egg problem. It requires a monumental mobilization of state resources. You have to import educators initially, you have to ruthlessly prioritize the training of a vanguard of local teachers, and you have to physically build schools in remote villages that have literally never had a brick-and-mortar institution before.
It's a massive undertaking.
Huge. And the presentation notes that not only did enrollment spike, but the student-teacher ratio in those primary schools vastly improved. That means they didn't just cram 80 kids into a room with one adult. They actually scaled the pedagogical infrastructure to keep the quality of education intact.
And they didn't stop at primary school either.
Yeah.
The data shows higher education, tertiary enrollment in universities and technical colleges has grown from essentially zero in the 1970s to approaching 30% today. Furthermore, the historical gap in literacy between adult men and women is rapidly shrinking.
We really cannot overstate the speed of this change. It is historically staggering. If you look at Western Europe, it took centuries to move from elite aristocratic literacy to universal youth literacy. It was a slow burn alongside the Industrial Revolution.
Right, it took a long time.
But the MEA region has done it in essentially 2 generations. They leaped over all those slow evolutionary steps.
It's the grandfather and granddaughter scenario we talked about at the beginning. The cultural friction must be intense. Like, how does a society culturally and mentally process that much new information so fast? When parents whose entire economic reality was defined by subsistence farming or manual labor are suddenly raising children who are reading philosophy, studying global markets, accessing the entire internet, that completely rewrites the social contract.
It absolutely rewrites expectations. When a population is mostly illiterate, their economic expectations are very localized, surviving the winter, making a good crop. But when 95% of your youth can read, write, code, and see the rest of the world on a smartphone, they expect to participate in the global digital economy.
Of course they do.
They expect formal employment. They expect upward mobility.
Which is a beautiful, triumphant thing, right? Until it crashes headfirst into a massive structural wall. Because when the researchers look at who is actually working in this newly educated, booming population, the data reveals a gaping paradox.
Yeah, it is arguably the single largest bottleneck to the region's future prosperity.
The gender gap. Looking at the labor market data on page 6, the disparity is glaring. Male labor force participation is relatively robust, sitting at roughly 73%. But female labor force participation is startlingly low. It is hovering between roughly 15% and 20%. The presentation specifically highlights it as being stuck around 17 to 19%.
And this isn't just an artifact of, say, older generations of women who never entered the workforce because of traditional roles. The researchers found a severe bottleneck specifically targeting young women.
The NEAT rate.
Yes, the NEAT rate, which stands for not in education, employment, or training. For female youth, this rate is exceptionally high.
So these young women are graduating from the primary schools and universities we just spent 5 minutes praising. And then they just vanish from the economic data. They don't get jobs. They aren't in training programs. They're completely sidelined.
This is where the data points collide in a really fascinating but frustrating way. We just established that the region has successfully educated its young women. The youth literacy gap is effectively closed.
So it's not a skill issue.
Absolutely not. The issue here is not a lack of capability, intellect, or education. Yet, there is a 4 times multiplier gap between men and women in the workforce. 73% versus maybe 17%. Why? Because of deep structural, cultural, and economic bottlenecks that are actively preventing these highly educated women from participating in the formal economy.
And we have to explain what those bottlenecks actually look like on the ground, because it's rarely just a simple matter of people saying, no, you can't work. It's structural. If a city lacks safe, reliable public transportation, a young woman might not be able to commute to an office safely. If corporate cultures demand rigid, uncompromising hours without any support for maternity leave or childcare, women are structurally forced out. If the legal frameworks regarding business ownership or financial independence make it harder for a woman to secure a small business loan, all of these invisible hurdles just stack up.
Exactly. It's a complex web of friction points. And the result of all that friction is a catastrophic loss of human capital.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and the cliche is always, leaving your best players on the bench during the big game. But I feel like that doesn't capture the scale of the financial loss.
No, it doesn't.
It's more like a country discovering a massive, multi-trillion-dollar sovereign wealth fund buried under their capital city. They spent decades building the complex drilling equipment to access it. That's the education system they just built. They finally tap into the wealth. The money is right there. And then they just refuse to open the vault.
Yeah.
It's like buying a billion-dollar supercomputer and deciding to only use it as a doorstop. How much GDP is simply being left on the table by keeping female participation at 17%?
Trillions. Literally trillions. From a pure, cold macroeconomic standpoint, regardless of any social, moral, or cultural arguments you want to make, a nation cannot achieve sustained, high-level economic growth if it voluntarily sidelines 50% of its educated talent.
It just doesn't work.
Think back to the demographic dividend we discussed. The entire concept relies on maximizing the number of working adults relative to dependents. It is mathematically impossible to fully realize that demographic economic boom if half of your working-age population is not generating formal economic output.
If a region wants to stop the economic roller coaster, if they want to pave that gravel road we talked about, they have to unlock that vault. It is the single biggest untapped economic engine they possess.
And to maintain this growing workforce, both the men currently working and the women who must be brought into the fold, public health, has to be the foundation.
Oh, absolutely.
You cannot build a high-functioning knowledge economy with a chronically sick population.
Which brings us to the public health data on page 7. And looking at the first half of this section, it is a massive, unequivocal victory lap for the MEA region. The triumphs over the last few decades are historic.
Life expectancy at birth has steadily climbed across the region to approximately 70 years. Under 5 child mortality has plummeted. Maternal mortality during childbirth has seen a dramatic, sustained decrease.
The data points out that skilled medical staff are now present for a vastly higher percentage of births. And I have to say, I really love that the academic presentation specifically notes the uncertainty bounds in the historical data for these health metrics.
Yeah, the shaded areas on the grass.
Right, they show the shaded areas of statistical variance. It proves how rigorous this source is.
Right.
They aren't just making broad guesses, they are showing the mathematical confidence intervals of how they know this region has conquered its historical health challenges.
Epidemiologists call this reversing traditional mortality. What that means mechanically is that the foundational interventions of modern medicine are working at scale. Widespread vaccination campaigns, access to clean water at birth, basic antibiotics, training midwives. These foundational steps mean people are surviving infancy and childbirth at rates that mirror the developed world.
But, and there's always a but.
There is.
You survive infancy, you survive childbirth, you get a great education, you enter the workforce, and then you step outside your brand new office and take a deep breath. And I'm looking at page 9 of the presentation here. The invisible killer. Air pollution.
The data on this is incredibly sobering, and it represents a profound epidemiological transition for the region. The average PM 2.5 exposure in the MEA region is staggeringly high. It is hovering between 45 and 53 micrograms per cubic meter.
Let's unpack the mechanics of PM 2.5 for a moment, because this isn't just smog or, a bad smell in the air. PM 2.5 refers to particulate matter that is 2.5 micrometers or smaller in diameter. To put that in perspective for the listener, a human hair is about 70 micrometers across.
So this is incredibly tiny.
This stuff is so microscopic that when you breathe it in, it doesn't just irritate your throat and make you calm. It is small enough to completely bypass the defenses of your lungs, enter the alveoli, and cross directly into your bloodstream. Once it's in your blood, it causes systemic inflammation all over your body. And the World Health Organization's guideline for safe, healthy levels is an annual average of just 5 micrograms per cubic meter.
And this region is averaging 45 to 53.
Roughly 10 times the safe limit.
Exactly. They have successfully beaten the acute, immediate threats of infant and maternal death, which is incredible, but they have traded them for chronic environmental health threats. A massive percentage of the population is living in conditions that far exceed even the most lenient temporary targets for air quality.
It's like fixing the leaks in a boat. You are bailing out the water, you successfully patch the holes that's curing the infant mortality. You are surviving the immediate danger of sinking. But then you look up from your work, wiping the sweat from your brow, and you realize your patched-up boat has drifted into a thick, toxic fog.
Right.
You aren't going to drown today, but the environment itself has become the long-term threat to your life.
That analogy is frighteningly accurate. Because the chronic diseases associated with years of high PM 2.5 exposure, we're talking ischemic heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, these are expensive, slow-moving killers.
They drain the system.
They are going to place an unbearable financial and logistical burden on the very healthcare systems the region just spent decades building up. A knowledge economy requires sharp, healthy, long-living workers. You simply can't maximize productivity if your workforce is suffering from chronic respiratory distress in their 40s.
So where is all this toxic fog coming from? If you want to fix the air, you have to find the smoke. And that leads us directly into the energy data on page 10. It ties right back to how the MEA region has powered the massive economic and demographic expansion we've been talking about.
Right. You cannot build a modern economy, and you certainly cannot educate millions of people without immense amounts of energy. And the data story here shows that electricity production in the MEA region is overwhelmingly dominated by fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and natural gas account for over 90% of the total energy mix.
Over 90%.
Yes. Renewable energy has only a faint, almost negligible presence in the charts here.
Now, to be fair to the policymakers in the region, the presentation does note a major infrastructural success hidden within this energy burn. Because of this massive utilization of fossil fuels, urban areas have reached nearly 100% electricity access.
Which is huge.
If you live in a city in the MEA region today, the lights turn on when you flip the switch. Hospitals have uninterrupted power for ventilators. Schools have power for computers. That is a monumental development milestone.
It absolutely is. You can't ignore that success. But the mechanical downside of relying entirely on combustion to achieve it is the carbon footprint and the particulate matter we just talked about. Carbon dioxide and methane emissions are climbing at alarming rates. The data specifically points to the transport and construction sectors as the main drivers of this emissions growth.
And this is where we really have to connect the dots across all these different pages of the report. Why are the transport and construction sectors booming so aggressively? Well, it's because of the demographic boom we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
If you have millions of young people surviving childhood because of better public health, and they are moving to cities to participate in this new knowledge economy, you have to physically build the space for them. You have to pour concrete, you have to forge steel, you have to build highways and enormous apartment blocks.
Precisely. To house and move a booming urban population, you have to construct entirely new urban grids. And the sheer physics of urbanization is incredibly carbon intensive.
Right. It's not just the trucks driving around.
No. Cement production alone releases massive amounts of CO2 chemically, completely aside from the energy used to heat the kilns. Steel manufacturing requires immense heat. Millions of new workers mean millions of new cars or buses on the road. The data on page 11 shows that per capita CO2 emissions fluctuate in direct, locked synchronization with economic activity. When the GNI per capita spikes, the carbon emissions spike right alongside it. They are inextricably linked.
But I want to advocate for the region here for a second, because it is very easy for analysts in the West, sitting in developed cities, to wag their fingers about fossil fuels.
Oh, definitely.
If you are a mayor or an urban planner in this region, and you have 1 million newly educated youth demanding housing and jobs right now, is it even physically possible to build a modern city for them overnight without relying on the cheap, dense energy of fossil fuels? Especially when you are literally sitting on some of the largest reserves of oil and natural gas on the planet.
It's a great point. It is entirely rational from a short-term, pragmatic development perspective. No economist would deny that fossil fuels built the modern world. The density and portability of that energy are what allowed for rapid urbanization globally. But the critical existential question going forward for the MEA region is, how do they decouple economic growth from carbon emissions?
Because they have to eventually.
Because right now, the cost of that cheap energy is the toxic fog of PM 2.5 that is slowly poisoning the very workforce they're trying to empower. They have to break the link between burning carbon and growing the GDP, or the healthcare costs will eventually consume all their economic gains.
Decoupling carbon from GDP is like the hardest trick in global economics right now. Every developed nation is trying to figure it out. How do you maintain the speed of a high-performance sports car without pumping out the exhaust? To escape this cycle of fossil fuel dependence, to escape the environmental trap, and to escape the cyclical volatility of the commodity markets, the MEA region is actively trying to pivot.
And we can see the early stages of this massive pivot in the GDP breakdown on page 12.
Let's look at that.
The data shows that agriculture's value added to GDP has dropped below 10%. The economic center of gravity is moving heavily and intentionally toward the service sector. And importantly, it's not just low-wage basic services.
Right, not just retail.
Exactly. The data shows the value added per service worker is rising, which is a really strong indicator of higher-level knowledge-based work taking root.
Agriculture dropping makes a lot of sense when you consider the water scarcity issues in the region and the massive urbanization we just talked about. People are moving off the farms and into the cities. The report also points out on page 13 that regional trade is becoming more active. They are trading with their neighbors more. Though, interestingly, it notes that foreign direct investment, or FDI net inflows, remain highly volatile.
Which brings us right back to the gravel road analogy.
Yep.
Foreign investors are still a bit jittery. They see the potential, but they also see the commodity-driven boom and bust cycles. They want stability before they commit billions of dollars to long-term projects in the region.
But the most optimistic data point in the entire 15 pages, the true spark of innovation, and the one that points to a sustainable exit strategy for the region, is regarding technological output.
This is where the long-term investments finally pay off.
Let's look at page 14. The number of scientific and technical journal articles published in the MEA region shows exponential growth. It didn't just inch up, it literally multiplied several times over in the late 2010s. And patent applications, both from local residents and non-residents filing in the region, are also climbing steadily.
If we look at the mechanics of this is what happens when a society commits to a generational leap. You take adult literacy from 3% to 75%, and youth literacy to over 95%. It takes one generation to educate the teachers, it takes another generation to build the universities, and it takes a third generation to train the researchers and fully fund the labs.
It's a pipeline.
It is. And we are witnessing the very early stages of a fundamental transition from a resource-driven economy pulling value out of the ground to a knowledge-driven economy pulling value out of the human mind. That 95% youth literacy rate is finally materializing into hard, quantifiable scientific output.
You can only export a barrel of oil once. Once you burn it, it's gone. But a patent,
Okay.
an algorithm, a scientific breakthrough, those can be exported infinitely. What this means is that the MEA region isn't just a place that sells raw materials to the rest of the world anymore. It is actively retooling itself into a place that exports ideas and innovation.
And ideas don't crash by 10% just because global demand for natural gas dipped.
Right.
Patents don't produce PM 2.5 pollution when you license them. A knowledge economy elegantly solves both the volatility problem and the environmental health problem simultaneously. It provides the traction to get the car off the gravel road.
Which brings us to the conclusion of our deep dive. We've synthesized all 15 pages of this dense, rigorous academic presentation, and the experts who compiled it distilled their final strategic recommendations into 3 core pillars. If the MEA region wants to survive these growing pains and truly thrive in the 21st century, they have a very specific, monumental to-do list.
It is a daunting but incredibly clear roadmap. Pillar number 1, gender equality. They absolutely must unlock the demographic dividend by bringing that highly educated female population, which is currently marooned at a 17% participation rate, into the formal workforce.
They have to open the vault.
They have to dismantle the structural bottlenecks. They cannot compete in a global knowledge economy with half their intellectual capital locked away.
Pillar number 2, green energy. They must break the over 90% fossil fuel addiction. This isn't just about meeting global climate targets to make the UN happy. It is a localized, urgent necessity to solve the public health crisis of PM 2.5 exposure. They have to ensure their cities remain livable and their workforce remains healthy.
And pillar number 3, innovation and economic resilience. They must stabilize foreign direct investment by proving they are more than just a volatile commodity market. And they must continue pivoting hard toward high-quality services and scientific innovation. They have to complete the transition from digging wealth out of the soil to generating wealth from the minds of their citizens.
It's an incredible narrative hidden inside a stack of data. I want to thank you for going on this deep dive with us today. It takes patience to look past the sensationalized daily headlines and truly understand the macroeconomic mechanics shaping the world.
The underlying data always tells a richer, more complex story than the news ever captures.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We talked at the very beginning about looking at a map and how the borders on a spreadsheet shifted to group these countries together into a unified economic destiny. We've seen how quickly this region went from a 3% literacy rate to publishing exponential amounts of scientific research. We've seen the sheer scale of the infrastructure they've built. So ask yourself this. If the MEA region manages to clear that one final massive bottleneck, if they successfully rewrite those structural rules and integrate the other half of their population, their highly educated women, into the global workforce, what happens to the global balance of intellectual and economic power? It's not just a demographic shift on a regional map. It could be the greatest unleashing of human capital the 21st century has ever seen. That map in your head. It might be time to redraw it entirely